Hello, and welcome to this event organised under the Farm Advisory Scheme and hosted here at the SRUC campus in Edinburgh. I'm Ken Rundle, and I've spent the day with researchers here at SRUC looking at what they're doing to try and help farmers face the challenges and the targets that have been part of climate change, something we've heard about so much in the last 2 weeks at COP26. Now, in the hour and a bit that we've got here, we're going to see some of the work being done by these particular researchers, and I'll get a chance to question them. But you're going to be able to get a chance to question them as well. And as you can see, all you've got to do is use the Q&A session of your Zoom. Now, it's true to say that as far as the commentators were concerned, agriculture didn't feature too much on the official agenda of COP26. But that's not to say that in the press, agriculture and climate change were mentioned a lot. Some of that comment was well-informed, some of it ill-informed, particularly from a Scottish context, and I know that annoys you. But we have to admit that we do face some real challenges as far as climate change is concerned. But it's not starting from zero. There's been a lot of thought put into this already, and researchers across all of Scotland's research institutes have been working on some of this for decades. And that research includes work going on at the farms from Scotland's Rural College. As the farms manager will now tell us.
I'd like to welcome you here to SRUC Farms. I'm George Bakey, I'm the Farms Director for all our farming operations throughout Scotland. We've approximately 4,500 hectares, 300 hectare organic farm up in Aberdeen, to 4,000 acres up in Crean-Larach, to the more intensive units here round about Edinburgh and across in Dumfries. This is the Howgate unit. It's a home for sort of 340 spring calving cows and 100 autumn calving cows, finishing everything, plus 1,000 yows, plus 100 breeding sows with a finish operation. The cows here are specifically bred to support research. We've got a sort of 14 generation pedigree stretching over the last 20, 30 years, breeding a crisscross Angus Limousin type of cow so that we have a control of the microbiome that these cows have. That sounds really fancy, it just means that we know what they've been fed, how they've been bred, and how they've been fed for going a long time. So if we need to use them for doing feeding trials or something like that, we know that the actual effect of whatever we're doing is not driven by the cows, it's actually driven by the product that we're using, whether it's a kind of a mineral additive or whatever it is. We are an unusual farm because obviously we're supporting a research and education institute as well. So a lot of grand ideas can come from the scientists, and we're a big field laboratory to test some of these things out. So not only are we supporting them to actually test this sort of thesis on different breeds of sheep or how different diseases affect livestock and how that affects the methane, we can actually test it on a farm scale. So the solutions coming forward for industry have been sort of bench tested a wee bit before they're actually promoted to the wider industry.
Well, George, that's quite a fascinating section there. I was interested in those cows, 20 years, and they all basically have the same rumen biome. So that if you do add any feed additives or anything like that, you get results which are based on fact.
I mean, I don't know if it's actually the same rumen biome, but what it is with a stable biome, so that any research we're doing, any things that we're doing, any outcome from that is driven by what we've done, as opposed to being individual cows differences or different breed differences. They are a stable population.
And that's management, nothing fancy with genetics or anything like that.
I mean, it's fancy genetics, and we're using AI and
not
stuff.
GM, though.
But it's not GM, nothing like that. No, this is just a stable, known source of cattle, basically.
But there's a whole range of things going on there. Which are the ones that excite you the most?
I think as a farmer, the thing that excites me most is that we're going to get to a point yet that we're going to be able to pick cattle with a carbon EBV, very much the same as we're picking bulls for calving age, gestation lengths, bulls as cow fathers.
This is because some cattle produce less methane than others. It's not necessarily tied to particular breeds, but it's individual cattle. And if you can identify those and breed from those, and you can gradually decrease the amount of methane produced.
That's exactly it. I mean, if you take 30 kilos of silage, 40 kilos of silage, feed it the same beast, one beast will grow faster than another, but at the same time, the same 40 kilos of silage, one beast might produce a lot less less methane than another beast might. And it's to try and identify, again, the algorithms will eventually determine what they look like, and we should get a carbon EBV along with the rest of the parameters we think.
And that's not pie in the sky 20, 30, 40 years away.
I mean, I'm 54. I like to think I'll see this long before I'm 60, to be honest. Yeah.
What about the carbon footprint? You're running farms where you've got peat restoration going on up in the Highlands at Kirkton, as well as reforestation and farm woodlands. Yeah. You've got dairying down in Dumfries and Galloway. I mean, what's the carbon footprint?
My carbon footprint is about 17,000 tonnes. That's the gross figure. That includes all the dairy cows, the pigs, all these sorts of things. But there's a sequestration on that, which takes us down to about the 9,000 tonnes. So the target I've got that I'm working against is the sort of 9,000 tonnes. So any sort of changes I make going forward are to try and reduce the 9,000. The 17,000 is quite a big number.
That's because you know the number, though, that you can actually start to attack it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's knowing what the number is to begin with means you can start kind of think about what changes can you make, and you can start modelling or at least thinking about how to knock that back a wee bit. Like, because you can't do, it's not going to be a one size fits all. It's not going to be one sudden magic bullet. It's going to be an accumulation of smaller things.
And it's as much that farm woodlands at Kirkton as anything else.
Yeah, and it might be we might plant more trees somewhere else, or we might do some more with the peat, or we might even start mintel and stuff for some places is useful. The plough might have a place. It's just that you can actually model that.
I'm fairly long in the tooth, and I can believe that something like this, climate change and the figures that are being talked about and the politicians, is absolutely frightening for anybody in the industry. But farmers tend to have short memories. In my working lifetime, we've had Chernobyl, we've had BSE, which was 10 years before it was discovered to affect humans, but it was affecting breeds and sales and exports before then. We've had E. coli, we've had foot and mouth at least twice in my lifetime. And each one of those has been regarded as a complete disaster, collapse of the beef industry with BSE, and yet it came back. So we can go through this. It can be tackled and it can be got through.
There's no question about that. And I mean, even I'm old enough to remember Chernobyl. I was spreading fertiliser in Aberdeenshire that very day. But you're right. I mean, foot and mouth, BSE, all these things have come along. We've found ways around them. We've found ways of adapting. And it's not just
Just had another one, the banning of the growth hormones.
Yeah, I probably did predate me a wee bit, that kind of style, to be fair. But no, I mean, again, as an industry, we're very adept at finding ways around these things. I think the secret here is in the science. Again, once we know what our number is, in my case, it's 17,000. I know what the grass and the trees and the peat and everything are knocking that back to. I now have a number I can work against, and science will help us through this. And just being careful and working our way through it without panicking, there is a solution to it.
Thank you, George. And if I can take your microphone and hand across here to Seamus Murphy. Now, all the work we just had George described is focused on helping the industry reach that Scottish Government target. We're talking about net zero emissions by 2040. That's a generation away. Now, it's already a tough enough target to meet, but we've just had COP26 and the compromise is there. Seamus here is an expert on carbon for SAC. So as a result, he spends a lot of time looking at the detail of things like that COP agreement. So Seamus, is there any devil in that detail?
Firstly, there's definitely plenty of detail in it, and that's the key to it. I think you mentioned it was complex, and that's really the key to the whole COP26 process. There's so many different parts to it. The driver of climate change is no doubt fossil fuels, and that takes up a lot of what COP26 was about. Agriculture didn't play as big a role as many would have liked. Agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases, and that is why agriculture needs to reduce its emissions in the long term. In terms of the actual detail from COP26, a lot of people with the announcements on Saturday evening and the actual report that came out, a lot of people were disappointed that we are still at about 2.4 degrees in terms of global warming. And we had hoped under the Paris Agreement to stay around 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees if possible. But a lot of countries like the Bahamas, Bangladesh, these places, their survival depends on 1.5 degrees. So it's really important that we do our bit to try and achieve that. There was a lot of different kind of announcements throughout, particularly the first week, that will have an impact on Scottish agriculture. All of these kind of big announcements will say, talking about trillions of dollars in spending or millions of tons of CO2. for the individual, and I say the individual rather than the farmer, because it's every single individual that has a part to play in this, not just farmers. Every single person has their bit to do. It can seem a bit kind of away from the everyday, day-to-day life, and particularly on farms, it can seem like something that is not going to affect them. But there are a lot of things in that will trickle down and start to have an impact on agriculture in Scotland.
And they are what?
Well, there's a couple of big ones that I kind of saw in the first week. There was one where there was a commitment made, a pledge to reduce methane by 30%. There was different countries all over the world committed to that. A lot of them weren't the important ones that you would like to see, but the UK were one of those countries, the European Union, USA. Now, within that pledge, they wanted to focus on fossil fuel, methane from fossil fuel production, although in the UK, in a lot of countries in the EU, agriculture is the highest emitter of methane. So it may turn out that this is a 30% reduction by 2030. It may turn out that agriculture will get pushed to reduce methane more.
This is the point. We can't sit on, nothing is set in stone. No. There's going to be changes all the way along. I mean, even what we're discussing today, the Scottish Government has said it's going to be learning by doing. And as they do and learn, they will maybe change the route as along which we go.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of talk about policy and a lot of talk about Scottish Government. But one other thing that did come out of COP26 was the kind of a mobilisation of the private sector. And there was a lot of talk about that. And I think farmers are definitely already seeing that in the markets, forcing low carbon farming as a means to reduce emissions, because that's what their consumers want, and they're bound to their consumers, and they're trying to reduce their emissions, looking at their supply chain, seeing where they can reduce emissions, and they're looking at livestock, they're looking at agriculture as a whole, and saying this is a key part of our supply chain where we have high emissions that we need to.
But the important thing is not to be driven, but to listen. And obviously they're key customers, these people. But at the same time, their requests have got to be reasonable and they've got to be understood, and there's got to be science behind it. And that's where some of the work we're talking about here can help in discussing that and coming up with whether the request is feasible in a Scottish context and not designed for the south of England, for example.
Absolutely. But I think those things, the policy, the market, these things are going to force a change in the industry for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Thank you, Seamus. Well, as he said there's a whole series of things on. Farmers have been tasked not just with climate change, but with food production. And also, of course, dealing with the whole business of biodiversity and trying to bring nature back into the countryside. Those three aren't always compatible, but they do have some things in common. For example, soil is the basis of all of them. And soil, of course, is the basis of everything to do with farming. And unfortunately, of course, it's something that farmers can do something about directly, as we're going to now hear from Paul Hargreaves.
My name's Paul Hargreaves. I'm a grassland researcher, soil scientist, based down at SRUC's Dairy Research and Innovation Centre in Dumfries. And today I'm just going to be talking a little around the idea of soil quality, and then lead on to some ideas of how this interacts with soil organic matter and build-up and sequestering of soil, which seems to be a good theme to think about at the moment, with the COP conference just wrapping up in Glasgow at the moment. So with soil quality, really this is a concept that first came to light in the 1990s. Its definition really is the function or the capability of the function of the soil to sustain biological productivity, to maintain environmental quality within the soil, and also to promote the health of the plants and animals that are within and rely on that soil. And animals in this case can also include humans as well. And I think this is important when we're thinking about things in agriculture. The concept of soil quality really came out of expanding on how we used to think of how we use soils in agriculture. In the past, it was really adding nutrients to improve yield, and that was the soil was just a function of that. Now with soil quality, we're looking at 3 different components. We're not playing down the importance of the soil nutrients and the pH and maintaining the correct balance of those, but it's also thinking about soil physics, the structure of the soil, how this helps drainage and promotes better root growth within the soil, and also equally as important, and there's an area that's come more to the fore now, is the idea of the biology of the soil. For a long time we know, or we're aware that things live and grow within the soil, and there's obvious organisms that we can think about, such as earthworms, that farmers hopefully see on a regular basis within their fields. But with newer technology, especially in the last 5, 10, 15 years, with things like PCR, where we can look at the DNA of the organisms within the soil, then really we can start looking at how these interact together, what kind of functional groups are in the soil, and there's this diversity. How can this help maintain the resilience of the soil quality? And so we start to look at all these things together. And for things such as nutrients, like I said, we still need to make sure that we've got the correct pH in the soil to ensure that the nutrients are being effective. But then this is really reliant on that soil biology as well. The nutrients that you're adding to your soils is being turned over by the biology within the soil and making that available to the plants that are growing there. And so soil structure is also very important with this as well, because that's the area, the gaps within the soil, not just the building blocks of the soil as well, that's where these microbial populations inhabit these areas, and this is where they function, and this is where the efficiency of that functioning is really dependent on getting oxygen to those areas. So if there's more water, if there's the drainage is poor, if you're getting standing water in your field, then the efficiency of those organisms are really being depleted. So the soil structure is important. I would probably say that because that's my area of research, and we've developed methodologies within SRUC to look visually at the soil structure and to assess any damage that's been done to that soil structure. Because we've seen, not only in our own research but other research, that a soil with a good structure, it can only take one pass from one heavy piece of farm machinery to reduce that soil structure by 70%. So it's something that can change very quickly, very dramatically, and then you've got to deal with that kind of problem. Down in Dumfries, we concentrate more on grassland fields, and even here you can get problems with compaction. We've purposely induced compaction into a grassland field, either through trampling by animals or by driving across with a tractor, and this was just one event at the end of a season, and we saw after 3 years a reduction of over 10% yield for the trampled swards, and over 14% reduction in yield for the tractor trampling. And it's not just yield that's important, that gets affected by changes and damage to the soil structure. It can also have other effects. And again, thinking about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, we also saw from the same experiments that over 3 years, the nitrous oxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas around 300 times more potent than CO2. The nitrous oxide emissions increased in the trampled plots by around 19%, but in the tractor compacted plots by around 45% in comparison to a part of the field that hadn't been compacted. So this is important to think about your soil structure and trying to alleviate that and be aware of any damage that might have happened. Another component of the soil that's becoming more prevalent, and again with climate change, global warming, and the thought about how we sequester carbon, is holding carbon or sequestering carbon within the soil itself. The soils are a global pool for carbon, over 3 times larger than the atmospheric pool and 4.5 times larger than the biotic pool. So the soils are important in this story here. And generally how the carbon is held within the soil is through organic matter. This is the dead and decaying parts of plants and animals that are working their way through the soils. And it's important that I'm saying working their way through the soils. We're not just burying material in the ground and it's inert and it doesn't do anything. The microbial populations are acting on the organic material as a food source, and so it can release nutrients to the soils to make them available for the crops that are growing within those soils as well and within those fields. So there's benefits for the farmers. Introducing organic material to your soils really should be a win-win for farmers. It's something that we should be really concentrating on. And it's a dynamic activity, this. It's the management of those soils and how you're adding the organic material to soil and how that's being turned over, and there is some release of CO2 to the soils, and we can control that in some ways. The more tillage you do of the soil, then the more CO2 is released. As you open up the soils, as you break them up, as you make the soil and the microbial populations within the soil more available to the oxygen in the atmosphere, this then increases their activity and they turn over that organic matter more quickly than if you haven't tilled your soil. So there is things we can do there. Also adding organic material through crop residues or organic fertilizers or slurry or farmyard manure is also methods of adding organic material to those soils. So it's important we think about this, and if we move from one system to another, we're hoping that we're going to add organic material, not take away organic material, because some of the organic material, it breaks down relatively quickly, like the sugars and starches within crop residues. Others can take years, tens of years, even hundreds of years to break down, and they're just retained within the soil there. Scottish soils in some ways are blessed by the amount of organic material that they have in them, especially soils on the west coast of Scotland have got high levels of organic material, but in general Scottish soils are between 5 and 10% organic matter. So really we've got to think about how we can maintain that organic matter within the soil. In some cases we may be struggling to add any more organic material to those soils. So maintenance may become the more important focus of managing those soils. But again, it's understanding how we do that. So really, we've got to think about ways of maintaining and improving organic matter within the soils, because they are important for the soil quality itself and the soil functions. And as I said before, there should be a win-win for the farmer of maintaining organic matter within the soil. And really, what we can be thinking about is not leaving soils bare. Thinking about what you do with your tillage, how deep you do that, how much tillage you do. Do you move to no-till or reduced till to try and stop opening up the soils and allowing the organic material to be burnt off, in a sense, by the biological activity within the soils? We can do this through use of cover crops, where we're growing crops between the cash crops to try and retain the nutrients within the soil, but also when that's ploughed back in, it increases the organic material and makes that available, hopefully, for the next crop growing. Also, some of these cover crops fix nitrogen, so they make nitrogen available for the next crop, be it an arable crop or whatever. The other aspects are thinking about hedgerows and tree planting, agroforestry, it being integrated within the arable or potentially the livestock farming systems to try and improve and increase the organic matter that way. Also, different measures of pasture management and trying to think about what residues are going back into the soils there and how we treat those pastures to improve or maintain the organic material there. And globally, we're also trying to think about, and also in Scotland and in the UK, the precision of the nutrients we add in, adding that when it's needed to the crop that needs it, so putting it into where the roots are growing. So this is also important challenges to think about. And finally, the use of organic manures, farmyard manures, slurries, and maybe even thinking about introducing more mixed farming into arable settings to get that organic matter back into the soils that probably need it most. So overall, I'm hoping you feel that soil quality is useful. These are methods that are being promoted on farm now with scorecards to look at this, the limiting factor of that. But in some ways, adding organic matter is really important to fulfill a lot of the components that we need to improve our soil quality.
Now, that's fascinating. It strikes me. It's important to remember there's more biodiversity under the ground below our feet than there is all around us, regardless of where you are in the world.
Oh, that's indeed true. And I think it just reflects how complex and complicated soils are, really. It's not just something that we walk across on the farm. And
what you were identifying there was that because obviously the interest in carbon, what farmers need to concentrate on and look at now is a lot more complicated than just doing your pH test and NP and K.
Yes, I think we're moving on from this kind of linear idea of you've got a field, you sow your crop and you add nutrients and then you harvest it at the end of it. It's more complicated there, but it should have benefit to the farmer as well, potentially reducing the amount of nutrients you're adding.
But the nutrient side of things is well known and there's plenty of research evidence. Some of these other things you were mentioning there are less well known, so there'll be a lot more learned in the next few years.
Yes, and I think it's putting some of the learning we already know together in sensible ways to reflect what's happening on farm, but also bringing out new pieces of research to look at this in a bit more detail.
I mean, what we seem to be talking about here is resilience. I mean, we're going with climate change. We're having to live with climate change as well as address it. And that means more floods, it means more droughts, and you're trying to make a soil that's able to cope with that.
No, that's indeed true. And I think, we've gone past the point now where we're going to, draw back completely from a climate change. And we need to consider how the climate is going to change, even in Scotland. And you may get drier summers and organic matter will help alleviate some of this.
So from an individual farmer's point of view, what's a sensible strategy? Because it's a journey, it's certainly not one event and that's it. It's a steady progress. What's the sensible strategy for soil management and improvement? Where would they start?
I think really you need to start by understanding that soil is complex, so there's a complexity to it, but also starting, I think you mentioned before, we need to start understanding what we've got to start off with, what you've got on your farm, what you're dealing with. You can't really make major management changes without monitoring what you're starting with.
And it's going to be different in different parts of the farm. These things are obvious, but sometimes some of the solutions suggested by various organisations aren't necessarily always that complex.
Yes, I mean, we're always looking for the simple answers to our problems, and we hate it when you've got to consider several factors. But unfortunately, soil is quite complicated, but the more knowledge you've got about it, then the better management decisions I think you can make.
What's a bit of a curveball, but what's the future for ploughing, do you think? We hear more about min-till and obviously mixed species swards in grazing and so on. Where does ploughing fit in, do you think, in the next 10, 15 years?
I think you're still going to have ploughing. I'm not saying get rid of your plough altogether, and we've seen in certain situations you've still got to plough to put structure back into your soil. If you've had if it's very compacted, then it's kind of the nuclear option, really. But I think there's going to be more emphasis on how deep and how much tillage we do and how much ploughing we do, and whether you can substitute some of that with other crops in the rotation.
And you'd still encourage farmers to get out there with a spade and have a good look at what's below the surface.
I always encourage farmers to get out there with a spade and have a look. I think there's no substitute for that, really. Getting your hands dirty. I mean, I would say that I'm a soil scientist, but I think that really does help with your a feel for what you've got.
Thanks, Paul. And if you've still got questions for any of our panel this evening, please carry on. Use the Q&A on the Zoom. Now, as Paul's just made clear, managing soils properly has become increasingly important as policy changes and the policy governments and so on look more closely at targets. But if you can't manage what you can't measure, so the earlier you are in the process of measuring carbon, the better, as Anna Sellers is going to tell us.
Hi, I'm Anna Sellers. I'm a Senior Rural Business Consultant with SAC Consulting. I'm here to talk to you today about the three big questions that farmers are asking about carbon. So it's really important for farmers to consider using a carbon footprinting tool to assess their emissions on farm. This is really useful for getting a baseline measurement of where you are and to be able to think going forward what areas you might be able to improve efficiency-wise, be able to reduce resource use and reduce your emissions ultimately. This creates a really useful baseline from which you can then benchmark your performance against other farmers, and it identifies areas of high emissions as well on farm, so you can target those areas, whether that's fuel use or feed use or performance of livestock. These measures as well can identify cost savings as much as they can reduce emissions, so they can really pay back spending that time in looking at those. And reducing emissions by, say, 10% over a number of years might seem like a big ask, but building up small incremental changes across the farm system will actually add up to quite significant changes overall. So if you're confused about where to start or don't really know how to begin doing that, it's really useful to think about getting some specialist advice from a farm advisor or looking at the Farming for a Better Climate website, where there's lots of resources and guidance notes on how to go about doing that. On farms, soil carbon can be increased or decreased depending on how the land is managed. All soils have resting carbon stocks, so existing carbon that is in the soil based on factors such as temperature, soil type, climate, the type of rocks that are naturally in the soil. So in the UK, that normally sits at between 80 and 120 tonnes of carbon per hectare at a 30 centimetre depth. Changes in the way that the land is managed, either through land use or land use change, or the way that it's managed through agricultural practices, can impact how whether that resting soil carbon stocks are increased or depleted. Agriculture is part of a natural carbon cycle where carbon is captured and stored within plants as biogenic carbon. This then feeds into the agricultural cycle through the grazing of livestock on grasses or the harvesting of plants to use for animal feed or food. And that then is regenerated back into the cycle through plants degrading or through livestock or human waste. Without interference in this system, it's in a carbon balance. So it's in an equilibrium, but the way that that system is managed agriculturally means that this soil carbon, the amount of soil carbon being recycled can be affected positively or negatively. The principle used by the IPCC is based on a 20-year period. So agricultural management practices, if they're continued over a 20-year period consistently, then at the end of 20 years, the soil carbon stocks can be said to be affected either positively or negatively. So for example, if grazing management practices have been improved over the 20 years, at the 20-year mark, the soil carbon stocks will be at an increased level. However, to continue the storage of carbon within the soil at the increased level, those management practices have to continue. And if you then want to increase to another increased level of carbon stocks, a new management practice has to be implemented on top of the ones that have originally been done. Carbon sequestration is not an infinite process, so you can't just keep sequestering carbon year after year. Similar to soil organic matter, there will be a natural threshold for carbon in soils and the amount that you're able to sequester. As part of the natural carbon cycle, carbon stored is removed by grazing animals, which is then recycled, returned back to the atmosphere in terms of enteric fermentation or manure. And the proportion of grass not eaten by the stock or removed by harvesting, together with roots, will then decompose and return soil carbon back into the soil. So the ability of grassland to sequester carbon really depends on various factors, including grassland management practices, forage utilisation, stocking density, reseeding practices, as well as land use factors such as the length of time it's been in grassland or the soil type. In many cases, management practices might deplete the soil carbon, or soil carbon might reach a state of carbon balance where soil carbon can no longer be increased without further beneficial management practices. So with good grassland management practices, it might be possible to increase the soil carbon sequestration through grassland, but it should be recognised that it's really just a fraction of total farm emissions. It's very unlikely that grassland sequestration will be able to offset total farm emissions. However, this is all the more reason to focus on reducing farm emissions across enterprises and across the system, as well as thinking about soil carbon sequestration through grassland. And really the next steps there are the best steps are to start measuring where you're at, to understand where you're at in terms of farm emissions, but also grassland sequestration. And from there, to be able to increase incremental changes across the system to both sequester and reduce emissions.
Anna, that was interesting there. I'm just wondering, how are farmers responding to this? There's those who've tried it already and those who are perhaps hanging back. What's the feedback you're getting?
Well, we've been working with farmers on carbon footprinting for several years now, really since the beginning of farm carbon footprinting. And what we found is that the process has really been driven by farmers. We're working with several thousand farmers now across the UK and beyond the UK, and we're finding that farmers are coming to us more and more, either individually as part of groups, really wanting to sort of understand where they're at, seeing what benefits there can be, both in managing carbon, but resource use and identifying efficiencies on farm. So farmers are really central to the process, and our system is really built around making it work for farmers in the best way possible. And
it comes back to the point George was making at the beginning there, that once he knows the numbers, he can start to look at where he can make the difference. And by getting a proper audit across the whole farm, you can identify in the early stages at least the easy options.
Definitely, yeah. And I think now we're seeing across the UK much more widespread sort of recognition that baselining is important, and that's been rolled out quite extensively now across the UK. But I think the real benefits come from those farmers who've been doing it for several years already, and that's still in quite small numbers. I mean, we've got quite a number now in the beef efficiency scheme in Scotland that have got several years of carbon footprints to refer back to and see what changes they have implemented over that time, what's worked, what they could still do, and look forward. I mean, there's nothing better than benchmarking against yourself. Really. And
it also shows up issues that they hadn't otherwise thought about or even considered, because suddenly we're looking at things through a different prism.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, AgriCalc, the SAC's carbon footprinting tool, is fundamentally a resource efficiency as well as a carbon calculator. So it's looking at carbon through the lens of resource efficiency, and it's really sort of looking at a lot of existing farm data, but in a different light, looking at it from a different perspective that they might, farmers might not necessarily look at the farm data in that way. And it has multiple benefits, not just for carbon.
It's an unfair question, I suppose, at this stage, but I've seen a lot of letters in press over the last few months, or even the last year, where farmers are claiming that they're already doing a lot of sequestration because of the organic matter in their soil. But then from what you were saying there, it's not as simple and straightforward as just high organic matter means lots of sequestration. It's a lot more complex.
Yes, yeah, I think, it is a very, very complex discussion that we're having at the moment. And this is where, getting a baseline measurement is so important. I think as well, going forward, there's also the question of whether such large amounts of carbon being sequestered is done by a practice that is sustainable long term as well. So a lot of these large gains for soil carbon sequestration might be coming from land use change, and the question is that sustainable long term from a business sustainability perspective as well, turning perhaps arable land into grassland, or turning grassland into biodiversity land.
So it's a case of get into the data, but also get talking to people in the know, and even fellow farmers particularly, and discuss it and work it round and get a greater understanding of what's going on.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, as you've been telling us there, if soil is something farmers can tackle straight head on, others of the low-hanging fruit is animal health. And it's absolutely true to say that the statistics show that animal health and disease is not as good as it should be, that things like lamb mortality or calf growth rates aren't as good as the targets that have been set. People need to look hard at these, because at the end of the day, it's waste. And these days, waste is measured in carbon terms, as our vet, Tim Garrity, is now going to explain.
Hello there, my name is Tim Garrity. I'm a vet with SRUC Vet Services, and we're here with George again to start a discussion on health planning and the potential gains, both in finance and carbon, that health planning can bring to a farm enterprise like this. I'm interested in health planning. I'm interested in preventative medicine, and have spent most of my career trying to learn as much as I can about it. And what I'm talking about today is a relatively new process that we've developed within SRUC, which we're calling dynamic health planning. Now, dynamic health planning is a little different to a standard health plan. And two of the key ways that it's different, the first is that it's farmer-led. So it's the farmer and the farm team that puts this health plan together. Of course, it's much more valuable if the vet contributes, and it's more valuable if a nutritionist contributes, but it has to be done by the farmer first and foremost. It's not something you can print online. It's not something that you do once a year just before your inspection date. It's something that you set up at the start of your production cycle and then work at it and revisit it 3 or 4 times during a year. So George, we're going to get started with a mini dynamic health plan today for Easter Howgate, and put some thought into the early steps as to how we'd get started. George, I wonder if you'd give us just a little background on the spring calving herd, just rough numbers, breeding dates, that kind of thing.
A recap from the previous, we've got a big herd of beef cows here at Easter Howgate. We predominance in spring calving cows. We aim for about 300 cows in the spring, we have about 100 in the autumn. We're on a shed here today with the autumn cows and calves that have just recently been housed. Health planning for us has always been really, really important, not only for the sort of normal benefits that a normal farmer would have in terms of kind of financial return and actually knowing what the cattle are actually doing, but for us, we've got the additional requirement to provide calves of a known parentage and of a known health status to go into trials and things, because the last thing we want to do if we're doing a feeding trial for calves to come down with a preventable disease of some description. The cattle, for some of you know, they're largely a Limousin Angus or Angus Limousin crisscross breeding. That program's been going on the go for quite a long time using an AI program. And some of you in the background will see the odd ling cow as well. We have 100 odd ling cows that use the sort of higher up grass and the more rougher parts of the business. But the calves, the progeny for all these cattle are used as part of the trials. And once they're finished, we take them to slaughter most of them. So we've got the data from birth to death, as it were.
Great. So today, just for the sake of this conversation, we're going to just think about the spring calving cows, which I think is somewhere in the region of 240, 200, thereabouts.
I confirmed Ken calf, yes.
Yes, cows to calve this coming spring. So we want to focus on that. One thing that's helpful when we set out to write a health plan or create a health plan is think about why we're doing it. And let's get a wee bit crude about it and make it in financial terms, because ultimately we want carbon improvements, we want healthier stock for a whole range of reasons. They're better to work with, etc. Clearly a high priority here, but fundamentally we want to chase a net margin and profit. We looked at the figures for Easter Howgate for last year, just from the spring herd, and just to give us a ballpark figure to hold in our mind, approximately if we could move the whole herd to textbook performance across fertility, calf survival and growth, there is an increase in net output of up to about £80,000 per year, which is a considerable chunk of money. If we could just make a marginal gain, somewhere around a 3 or 4% gain across each of those figures, then we could maybe realise somewhere in the region of £18,000 per year from the spring herd.
That would be useful.
Does it sound realistic to you? Is that a figure that you
Yeah, it sounds useful. I mean, I would always caveat that the 80,000 would be in a perfect world, and we're far from a perfect world. We have constraints others have. But I mean, a £20,000 marginal gain would be a very useful thing to chase.
Fantastic, excellent. So that's the money we're after. That's where the profit in health planning lies, and that potential gain that we can make. But the carbon in health planning lies in exactly the same space. If we move these cattle to be more productive in terms of financial output, they will be producing more product for every kilo of carbon that the herd produces. So that's what we're chasing, £20,000, and we're going to start by setting some targets. Good. All right, we're chasing a marginal gain. We estimate that marginal gain might be worth in the region of £20,000 and a whole load of carbon. And we're going to start by setting very specific targets for what this spring herd is going to do next year. Very briefly, we'll review what they did last year, because then we can set a sensible marginal improvement for next year. So we'll run through this chart, and George, you just keep me right, make sure this is correct. We had 249 pregnant cows in the spring herd last year, with a small number of twins brought us up at this time last year to 254 fetuses, calves conceived on farm. Of those we registered, so that's alive at the first few days of life, 232. So we lost somewhere between conception and registration about 9% of those calves. We weaned, at 200 days old, we weaned somewhere in the region of 220 calves last year. So we're down at about 87, another 12 calves lost between registration and weaning. Our weights then, 200-day corrected weaning weight of 256 kilos, giving us an average daily gain across the herd of 1.08 kilos per day. And then the last thing, because it comes last in terms of the cow's production cycle, getting those cows back in calve. We did pretty well with a very tight calving here, just 9 weeks of breeding. Our cows came in at 86%, and our heifers came in at 61%. That's maiden heifers going to the AI for the first time. George, any comments on them or any thoughts on them before we move on?
Obviously, starting on the thing you finished off with, my heifer conceptions are something we're very concerned about, and something we've got sort of active programs to deal with going forward. The cows are good enough. Again, they're okay. They're not fantastic. I like to think we could do a wee bit better. In terms of the calf weights, I'm quite happy with the calf weights at 256 kilos on average, but like everything, on average, a foot in the fire and a foot in the fridge, you're okay. My concern is that is masking the fact that 20 to 30% of the calves are not actually achieving that. There's some calves doing exceptionally well, but there are other calves that are not doing quite so much. That's partly due to a breed thing, but it is also to do with the age of the cows and how we manage the cows. I think it's something we need to have a think about going forward. In terms of the actual numbers going up to the start, I suppose this is where disasters, everybody gets disaster zones in a herd here. I mean, if you think about this number, that 232 is what we registered, that's what we got a passport for. However, 12 of them departed this earth before they were weaned. You can, so that's something as a farmer, that's the factor that we need to be very, very aware of. In terms of the conception and stuff at the start, I mean, we're where we are. I mean, that's what we've got with 249 cows in calf. That's driven by how well the bulls did and how well the AI program did before. As I said before, we're very, very tight on the bulling period. It is 9 weeks, whether it's bulls or AI. That is the sort of red lines that we want to cross over, as it were. Like I once had a client in a previous job who, when you asked him when he started calving, he would say at the end of the last war. That is certainly not what we are. We are looking at 9-week calving, bulls out.
Magic. All right. So we've looked at last year. We know the money available. We have done really well on seasonality in terms of breeding cycle 9 weeks, tight and has been for some time. We've got good growth rates, although there's a bottom end of that we need to pay attention to, and we can improve on particularly heifer fertility and probably calf survival are the two. That's where the main part of that £20,000 we're chasing lies. We're going to set targets now, fetus to fetus. So we've done our PDs. We've been ahead of the game. We know that we've got 234 pregnant cows, and with twins, we've got 240 calves conceived. So how many this year, George, will we register? What's the target?
Well, if I recall what I had last year, although I had more cows last year, I think I registered 232 calves. I would like to think I can register 230 calves this year. I think we need to aim for that at least. The conception, I mean, even with the heifers and stuff, we're putting in a lot of management into that now to make sure these beasts are fit to breed. One of the reasons our cow numbers are down is we've withdrawn any difficult breeders, anything at all, so we have genuinely efficient cows, hopefully.
And that would be a big improvement. In a percentage term, we were about 91% last year. This would bring us in 95, 96% this year against calves conceived. How many will we wean?
Well, last year we lost 12 calves. Over the summertime for various disasters, I suppose. I think we should be aiming for 220 again. Is that unreasonable? 220?
Okay, yeah, 220. Again, it would be a slight improvement. There was 12 calves lost last year. That would be 10 calves lost this year, so probably achievable.
Hopefully.
Could be slightly more ambitious, but we'll go with 220. The weights then, what will they weigh? Do you want to shall we do it on growth rate per day?
Well, I mean, what I got last year, just to recap, was 256 kilos at 1.08 kilos. Now, we know that there's a tail end in that. I think the 256 kilos, I think I'm quite happy with, but that's a standardised 200-day weight. I want it on all my calves or get the bottom end up. So I want a better live weight gain. I think this is what I was aiming for, rather than work too much with the weight. Yep. I would suggest that if we get everything to 1.2, that would be fantastic. That's probably too far, is it?
That's going to be too high on last year. Let's go for at least 80% of calves, which would be an improvement, doing 1.1. I think if you get 80% doing 1.1, again, it's the marginal gain we want. Yep. We can improve on that again the following year, but that would be a fantastic outcome. Cows pregnant, just a percentage here. It's only 9 weeks. We got 86% last year. What will we get this year?
I always like more, but I mean, if we can get 90%, that'd be fine.
Absolutely, 4% improvement. We'll take that.
But I mean, in our defence, we are using AI program and bulls in that, so there is always the effect of the AI in this.
Do you want a wiggle room? Do you want 8 to 8?
I put a plus or minus 2%.
Okay, we'll accept that. And the heifer pregnancy rate to AI?
I mean, I have to admit, my heifer conceptions is not good enough. I mean, last year we're sitting at 61%. I want it above 75, preferably nearer 80, but above 75.
Okay, and again, that would be a huge achievement based on last year.
It is, but I mean, I think it's achievable because we're heifers now. What we're doing is, or what the plan is, that we're going to, they're all pelvic scored. So any sort of free martins, anything that is no cycling, stuff we can knock out at the very start. They're the right age, they're the right weight. They have no reason not to breed. We've got a specific programme for them this next year as well. So I'd like to think in a 9-week programme, they should be able to stop the heifer, 3/4 of the heifer, surely.
Good man, brilliant. And we have set very specific, very measurable, achievable, relevant and time-limited targets for George at the start of this dynamic health plan. And we know this one sheet of paper now is worth £20,000. So it's an expensive bit of paper, it's a worthwhile bit of paper to think about. And we're going to take this and stick it up in the farm office for the whole farm team to see, and we'll track that now over the course of the year.
And you'll notice it's been highlighted with hazard tape, so I'm sure the boys will appreciate that.
All right, we know the money we're chasing. We know how we're going to do it, as in we've set very specific targets for the year. Yep. The next step in a dynamic health plan is to think about why are we not going to achieve those goals? What's going to go wrong? How bad can it be when it's at its worst that will stop us achieving those goals? And when we do that, we're going to focus on just the next 3 or 4 months. We don't need to do the whole year. We're just going to think about what risks are those cows facing right now and in the next weeks and months that are going to stop us achieving those targets. The best way to do that, I would suggest, is get the whole farm team together, have the poster up on the wall, and we're going to have a cup of coffee and spend half an hour, 40 minutes brainstorming what can go wrong. And out of that, for every one idea that any of your team comes up with that says that might happen, this might happen, we need to think of one thing we can do today or in the coming weeks that will reduce the likelihood. So common risks at this time of year that I'm sure will come out of it will be around abortion risk, coming from feed and from forage, from infectious disease, from cow handling, and we'll have some thought on cow nutrition, of course, and making sure cows are in the right condition for calving. We call these a banana skin session because we're looking for the banana skins that are going to stop you achieving your £20,000. Do you think you would manage to run this session for us?
I think we can manage to do this. Like, I mean, I'm actually just started a new cattleman today anyway. Like, so I mean, we need a bit of an induction with him in the next fortnight, 3 weeks anyway. So this would actually be a very good exercise to do at the same time, and a bit of team building with the guys as well to try and just challenge what some of these targets are. They might think I'm mad, but equally they're going to be the guys that fill in the calf creeps and that later on in the season. But I mean, before we get to that point, they are the guys on the ground who are actually doing the calving. If that's where the calf mortality is. But before that, in terms of actually handling the cows and making sure we get the right diets to them at the right times and the nutritional status is right. Yep, that's absolutely all things they can do.
Brilliant, brilliant. All right. So we've set up a banana skin session. We're going to do that 3 or 4 times over the year. We just plan 3 months ahead, 4 months ahead, and we keep our eye on any preventative actions we can think of to help us achieve those targets. Monitoring here is very good. We saw the figures. We got those figures in about 10 minutes. So we've got very good data streams. So I'm not going to talk too much on monitoring. Please, if you want to try a dynamic health plan yourself, don't let monitoring be an issue. All you need, once you've set your target, you just need to know, did you hit your target or not? That's the minimum you need to do. Quite often that just means doing your PDs, counting how many weaned calves you have and weighing them. That can be as little as that can help you see if you've hit your targets. So don't let monitoring be a target. And then this time next year, we must come back and review. We're going to keep this piece of paper and we're going to see how we got on. And that closes the circle when we complete the thing and we think, right, how did we get on? And right now, I suspect, and this is nothing to do with Easter Howgate, this is just life and livestock, we are going to fail. We're not going to hit those targets.
Sod's law says something will not go right.
Exactly, we're not going to hit those targets. And as part of dynamic health planning and expectation management, we don't actually mind. We've set very ambitious gains. We're going to work very hard to get them, but we may not get them and we probably won't get them. Now, the key thing here is that that's not really failure. Not hitting your target is okay. Failure is not learning from it. So the major challenge, the big thing we have to do is that we know we didn't hit the target. We don't beat ourselves up about that. We've all tried our best, but we're going to learn why did we not hit the target. And that means over this year, if we do have abortions, we must investigate them. If we've got stillbirths, we have to get them in for a post-mortem. If we've got pneumonia, scours, any of these problems, we must be doing diagnostics and understanding what's driving us not hitting that target. And as long as we learn from not hitting the target, then that's no failure at all.
No, I mean, I think the important thing is learning and managing the risks that we can genuinely and sensibly manage, and not doing daft things like doing something we shouldn't have done, that kind of stuff. Or at least if we do, put a hand up to say we did it, like, or didn't do it.
Good man. Thank you, George. We'll be back in a year.
Well, I hope so. With 20 grand, that'd be good.
With 20k.
So let's talk more about banana skins then. So basically, that struck me as being very similar to the space industry, where they had some major disasters and then basically went back to ground zero and said, right, okay, we're going to check everything we do and somebody's going to tick it off and we're going to go through this whole process. Is that really what you're talking about with banana skins, or is it less severe than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it's a silly way of saying it, but it's risk management. So it's sort of taking the time to sit down and think, right, what might go wrong in the next 3 months, in the next 4 months.
And that 3 months is important. You don't give yourself too long a period, just something that's manageable.
Yeah, that for me, that's really important, because health planning at the minute is often done once a year. So we'll try and sit down and imagine everything that we're going to do for a whole year's time. Now, that's very, very difficult to remember what you said you would do in June.
And seasons change anyway. So what you thought, because you're planning this year based on the year that's just gone past, and at the moment seasons are going all over the place, and you can never.
Absolutely, circumstances change all the time, particularly in agriculture. We don't know what grass growth is going to be like in the spring, so what's the point in trying to risk manage that right now? We can deal with that nearer the time, and the things that are likely to trip us up when we're chasing production improvements, we need to focus on what's important right in front of us right now in the next 2 and 3 months.
And how important is it to get everyone on the farm involved in that discussion?
Yeah, fundamental. If you've, lots of farms are one-man shows or very small family farming units, and that, in those circumstances, it can be easier. But as soon as your staffing goes up, you need buy-in from everybody. I think in our clip there, George mentioned that the people who actually deliver on that, we had this piece of paper up with £20,000 at the top of it. The people who will make that are the stock people that work with the cattle every day. They're the only ones who can deliver on those targets. And if they're not bought into that and really engaged, then we're going to struggle.
Now, the message about herd health planning has been around for a long time. I know that myself. So a lot of what you said has been known of for years, but not taken up. But I'm just wondering, with this whole business of carbon and the emphasis on carbon and waste and so on, is this going to be an extra spur, and do you therefore look forward to it?
Yes, it can be. I think anything that encourages us to do more preventative medicine, and that's the way the vets would think about it, more proactive actions that improve animal welfare or reduce antimicrobial use or reduce carbon, fundamentally make more money. That's all to the good. And when we think about the sort of carbon issue with animal health, it's a really good story to tell, because if you want to buy an electric car right now, it's going to cost you a lot more than buying a diesel car, so it's expensive to take the low carbon option. With animal health, it's expensive to take the high carbon option. So all of our interests are aligned. If we're making more money, we're saving carbon, we're using less antibiotics, so these things all line up. And that's helpful.
And it's important to bear in mind that while we're hearing a lot more in terms of the vaccine developments and some exciting vaccine developments coming along, on all sorts of other medicines, because the animal sector, the livestock sector is declining, there's less attractive. It's less attractive for the drug companies to do something about. So we're going to begin to work in an environment where there's fewer medicines, and we're certainly a drive to drive down antibiotic use. So the more resilient the animal is, the more healthy the animal is already, the more prevention you can do, the better.
Absolutely. We need to be promoting vaccine use. Vaccines, remember, you can't give a vaccine when you start a problem today. Very few vaccines work by protecting your stock straight away. You need to be working that month or two ahead. That's how long it takes for a vaccine to start to be effective. And again, that idea of let's work 3 months ahead of ourselves and remember when vaccines go in, that is absolutely fundamental. But the vaccine will only stimulate one very, very small, tiny bit of that animal's immune system. Good nutrition would stimulate the entire immune system and make her more resilient to all sorts of disease challenges. So yeah, the basics on genetics and nutrition and management can do an awful lot more for your immune system than just a single vaccine.
Thanks, Tim. But stay there because we're going to have our panel session in very short time. But first, can I speak to Robert Ramsey, a beef specialist with SAC Consulting and himself a young farmer. We've been looking at various ways, Robert, we can begin the task of addressing the carbon footprint and helping agriculture meet its targets. But a lot of it just seems to be more efficient husbandry.
Yeah, there's no doubt efficiency is what's driving everything we're doing these days. Efficient husbandry, just as Tim was saying there, these pillars, fertility, survival, growth, if we can get more animals on the ground, get them growing, get them thriving, get them turned over quicker and reduce our losses, there's no doubt that that's the single biggest thing we can do on most most livestock businesses to reduce our carbon footprint.
And more money to invest, that's the point.
Exactly.
It's going to need investment. This industry is going to need investment for the next few decades at least.
The equation of carbon equals money isn't correct, but it's correct enough that we can, it's very closely correlated that if we can improve efficiency, reduce the losses to the system in terms of methane, we can actually ultimately make more money as well.
So what are you focusing on at home?
Lots of things. And I'm really lucky that I farm at home and I also do this job as well. So I'm exposed to really good people and then I get the chance to go home and do something or have a go at home as well. I certainly don't have a monopoly on progress. There's some amazing things happening across all of Scotland and I suppose I dip in and have a go at some of them. And certainly we've been focusing on at the beef end of things, focusing on fertility, trying to get more calves on the ground and tighten up our calving period, reduced our age at calving down to 2, and then similar in the ewe flock is to try and get more lambs on the ground for the same level of the same size of flock. But again, there's more to it than just the herd and the flock. We're looking at rotational grazing and looking at soils, and something I'm quite passionate about doing is looking at the organic systems and looking at even the new regenerative stuff. There's a whole load of good things in there that I can pick up and do small bits of, and these small marginal gains, if you like, we can chip away at things and make lots of small progress can actually lead to quite a significant saving.
And the key thing there is you need a mixed farming setup for the best organics.
We do, definitely.
But I've also been speaking to farmers and I'm getting some really one or two who are fearful for the future, thinking hard about whether it's worth continuing and carrying on, because what's ahead of them is just so tough. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I suppose I'm very grateful for you referring to me as a young farmer earlier as well. That was really good. But I suppose at my time of life, we should be really positive. We should be looking to the future and embracing changes. I totally understand why older farmers at the tail end of their career are now looking at this and thinking there is a sea change of certainly government policy and economics as well at the moment. Things are changing fast. We've asked for change for a lot of years. We've been openly, farmers have been saying for 30, 40 years, things are going to have to change. Now things are changing and we don't all like it. But to me, there's so many, as farmers and land managers, we are absolutely part of the solution here. We're involved in the problem. We're in a high emitting industry, but we also are one of the only other industries that can sequester carbon. And as we've discussed today, there's so much scope to change our systems and actually become a really, really important part of the solution.
And the other point too is those other two elements that the industry has been asked to do, which is provide food and look at biodiversity loss. All of those things are going to be vitally important. So being a land manager is a very different job to what it was in 1948, 49, with starving Europe.
And that's where, at that stage, there was one pillar, food production, and we did sacrifice a lot, certainly biodiversity and climate. There were big sacrifices made in basically in a drive to produce as much food as we could. We've totally stepped off that pillar, and we're at the moment, the focus is entirely on carbon. And for me, that's a real worry that we do need to focus on these other two in equal measure, that it's a three-legged stool. And it's really important that we focus on the three things that as farmers we can deliver is climate change mitigation, biodiversity benefits, and crucially food production.
Well, stay there, Robert. We're going to come back for the panel. But in the meantime, Scottish farmers have been addressing the climate change issue for quite a while. And here's some of those that have been working for it.
Installing 160 solar panels and making greater use of renewables.
Why we graze cattle and sheep on pasture.
Purchased a EID whey platform.
We're paddock grazing to reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilisers.
Buying local feed in from either potatoes, bread, barley.
We're growing hardwood trees.
The use of clover within soils. We improve the organic matter in our soils.
By practicing regenerative agriculture.
By reducing tillage on our farm.
Through our aeration and crop conditioning system.
Grow as much grass as possible. Is my hybrid diesel hydrogen tractor.
I was implementing herbal leaves.
By reducing the amount of ploughing that we do on the farm.
By reducing the emissions from our slurry by spreading with a dribble bar rather than a spread plate.
And one of the biggest things we've done for climate emissions is remove soya from the dairy cow diets.
By growing clover.
There's just some ideas there about what can be done. And it's all one or two items, but it's all progress. Now we can go on to the questions that you've been sending in for the panel. And I'll start with you, George Bakey out there. How far away are we from having a commercially available methane test for cows?
Oh, I think we're quite away from doing it for the individual cows. I mean, where we are is that we're looking at developing algorithms to look at breeds of cows and things. Not so much breeds of cows, but we've to understand the systems that are out there in place, what the differences are, and actually measure and try and validate that. So some way away from it. But I mean, to me mind, it's about, we're going to get to the stage, we're going to have an EVV at some point, and it's going to come in through the breed societies, much the same as Calvin scores did and things like that. So I mean, we're probably 4 or 5 years away, but it won't be an individual thing. You're not going to go and take a breath test to a cow, a bit like a breathalyzer policeman would do and say, right, that's a good cow, it's a bad cow. That's not what the intention is here. It's more a systems approach to the whole thing.
Yeah, because coming back to the variables you were talking about, over a day in the life of a cow, there's going to be all kinds of differences in
I know. We have the same cow in different environments, so you get a different answer.
We have a technical issue in that one of the mics is broken down, so we're going to have to keep passing this one. Robert, you've got a comment to make.
Yeah, really, just, I suppose, reiterating what George said there, but the role of genetics is so important here that many of the high-end pedigree breeders are actually already testing for methane or measuring methane output and tying it to feed conversion efficiency as well. So there's a lot of good stuff really coming into that genetics element. And if you look at where particularly other breeds are available, but the stabilizer breed have done a huge amount of work on methane and on feed conversion. There's a lot of really exciting genetic stuff there with an EBV for it already. And also, as we move into the genomics world as well, there's a heap of progress that we made there. So for me, the individual test for the cow, yeah, it'll come at some point. But the fact that the genetics, the core genetics are coming, or the selection pressure put in that area means that progress is going to trickle down the chain pretty rapidly.
It's a realignment. You any comment from a veterinary point of view, Tim?
No, not much to add there. I think we've covered that well. I completely agree. We don't need individual cattle on individual farms to be measured for this. The net feed efficiency, we need to be selecting on net feed efficiency, and that will by itself reduce methane output. And as soon as we can get that well into EBVs, we're all in a much better position.
Good. Now we've got a soil science question. Will increasing the carbon content of soils lead to a requirement for more nitrogen to be used in the future to maintain CN ratio?
Well, we know from previous research that adding more organic material to the soil does change the C to N ratio. So potentially in the first year you start a new regime and start adding more organic material, then you will need to add or compensate that with some more nitrogen. If the organic material that you're adding isn't nitrogen rich itself. So that might facilitate some extra potentially bagged fertilizer as a quick fix for that, just to ensure that you get the same yield there and the nutrients aren't taken up that you're adding for that crop being taken up by the microbial populations utilising the new organic matter. However, that should only be for 1 or potentially 2 years. Once the system is acclimatized to the new levels of organic material being added, then it should stabilize and you're back to using or relying on the same levels of nitrogen. You could try and balance that up with the nitrogen in your slurry, if you know what that is, and adding more slurry, but that's if you have that in your system. If not, then you're going to have to rely on it.
Interesting you should say that, because George was telling me about this something earlier, something you're about to do with your slurry spreading.
Yeah, I suppose as most farmers know, that the price of fertilisers are going a wee bit exponential in the last wee while, and something we'd had in mind to buy anyway was a harvest lab to put onto the dribble bar, so that it's the same harvest lab as you get on silage harvesters and combines and stuff, but essentially as you're pumping the slurry through it, it'll measure in real time the nitrogen, phosphate, potash, dry matter, organic and water content, as it were. So when you're putting it on, you actually have a known volume of a known quality, as it were. So we know we've applied, it's not just a case of applying 30 cubic metres to the hectare, you've actually applied a set amount of nutrient as well. And once we get this thing up and running, because of the price of fertiliser this year, we're actually going to be top dressing cereals, we dairy slurries and things this year, just to see where it goes. It could be a bit interesting in the spring to make sure the crops are not too strong at the time to handle the pipe. But I mean, essentially measuring and managing what we're putting on, what we're aiming to do there.
Which is quite innovation. There's a question here which is very technical as far as I'm concerned. Is there any interest in Scotland SAC in re-establishing soil biology, to have the biology do the soil chemistry and soil physics, i.e. get to the point where we rely on soil biology to extract all the minerals needed by crops from sand, silt and clay particles?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's something that people are starting to look at now. There is work, especially say in the more organic farming systems, of where the nutrient inputs are more controlled, shall we say, of trying to establish a balance of soil biology. Again, I think it's research that's coming through with the more modern methodologies of assessing what soil biology you've got and using that to look at how those groups interact together. Potentially also thinking about how it reacts with the root systems of the crops, different varieties, different mixtures of varieties, and whether you can do that through intercropping or mixed cropping systems, because potentially there's more diversity of soil biology, the more diversity of cover that you've got. So I think it's an ongoing piece of work at the moment, but it is becoming more prevalent, and the idea that soil biology can start supplying some of these nutrients from the soil. However, at some point you're going to have to add some nutrients back in there.
But it's interesting that just like we're learning more about the relationship between trees and fungi, which help the trees take in nutrients, we're also learning far more about what's happening under our feet, which seems to have an open book as far as that's concerned.
Yes, I mean it's an eye-opening each discovery or interaction that we find there, and as you say, with the woodland, I think it's been dubbed the wood wide web, where they're using soil hyphae to communicate with each other, even down to claims about kind of beneficial for dead trees to have their own saplings come through to replace those.
And the key thing here is this is all a bit esoteric maybe, but at the same time it shows you what research, once the research is focused and there's a new demand for research coming through because of climate change, it's amazing what we're going to learn and what we're going to discover and new developments coming through, which is encouraging at least. Can I move on? We've got some more on the cattle. And will we likely see a turn towards native breeds as terminal sires? Robert.
So again, a good question, and one we've probably had for quite a long time, and something we're seeing. There's been a pretty, even in my career, there's been a fairly radical change in some herds. But to say we're going to see a move to native sires, yes, there's a direction of travel there, that there's more native bred cows in the country, but those continental terminal sires have a huge role to play in actually producing a high value sellable carcass as we market them at the moment. So I think definitely that maternal cows, so we see certainly a big swing to that low cost, easier kept cows. So the ling cow, for example, there's a huge growth in them at the moment, but there's a lot of good ling cows go to a good Charlie bull and produce a really high value saleable suckled calf, which can be finished very efficiently, with a low carbon footprint and a kind of standard finishing system. So will we see a swing? I think it'll swing back and forward, but I think there's definitely a need. Politicians answer, I suppose, but there's definitely a need for both the native genetics and also the good continental.
It also comes back to this function thing. I mean, yes, we're producing food and we're producing meat as economically as possible, both in carbon terms and financially. But at the same time, we may need that cow out there doing something for the habitat development, etc. So again, you pick your horses for courses.
Yeah, definitely. And again, there's more than one. It's maybe worth George saying something about autumn calvers at Easter Howgate. There's more than one way to skin a cat here as well, that we can do conservation methods with. It doesn't have to be a hairy Highland cow, although she's got a huge part to play and always will have a huge part to play in maintaining the upland areas of Scotland.
So I'll pass it to George. What you're suggesting really is as much a change of systems rather than a change of breeds or whatever it might be.
To pick up on that as well, and I suppose you maybe see this with the cows we have at Kirktown. I mean, with the cows that we have up there are sort of Angus, short-horn, kind of wee Orkney cows, which I'm quite familiar with. But I mean, these cows are quite lightweight cows that will tramp through heather and stuff and break it up a wee bit. So you're creating passageways for other animals and things to move around in the countryside. You don't get these stands of heather at a metre high; they're absolutely solid. So you create breaking up bits and doing that, and then by feeding them, you're creating a wee bit of poaching and rings and things, which again attracts certain birds and things. So it's not the cow. It's not just about producing beef in that case. She's actually there as a biodiversity management tool almost in a style. And Robert mentioned the autumn cows we have at Easter Howgate, and I've always been a big fan of autumn calved cows. Don't know why. Some would say they're very expensive cows, but what we use the cows for is that these cows have just come in just now with a calved foot. They'll be in the shed in the winter time with the rest of them, obviously. And then the mums will all get kicked out end of March into early April. And then these cows, where we are at Howgate, we've got 3 quite high hills. If those of you know where the farm is, it's essentially the ski slope at Edinburgh, that hill, the hill in the middle, and the next hill, the 2 green hills up where we tend to try and put cows. And these are hills that they're not massively productive, but for a maintenance of a cow that is doing nothing more than just managing the grass for us, she's a really, really useful cow. It's a very cheap system for us to keep the cow up there. She's doing a very good job, but she's left the calf in the shed that we can actually do something with. These are just the red and black cow that have our Limmy Angus crosses. They're still producing a very, very good beast, as it were, without being necessarily a old-fashioned breed, if you know what I mean, more native breeds. So it's just a case of making sure you fit the system you've got. Well,
I've got one more question, and that was, how do we pass it to your neighbour, Anna? How do we go about establishing the carbon content of the soil? Is it a few simple sample points per field or per farm, or is it a GPS mapping type measuring and recording system?
Yeah, well, I think there's a role to be played with all those different measures as well, and perhaps Paul will pick up on measurement in field in a bit more detail. But I think it's also worth mentioning that it's worth looking at models of soil carbon sequestration as well to get a sort of overarching whole farm picture. And that's something that AgriCalc has been developing and testing. It's available at the moment by request, largely because it just involves a bit more work with an SAC consultant to understand a bit more what the results mean. But the benefit in that is that it uses resting carbon stocks for based on a postcode. So it gives a baseline measure for soil carbon stocks across the farm. While that might not represent the sort of the differences perhaps within a field of changes in the soil carbon, it's perhaps more useful longer term as a pathfinder in that it reduces the huge variability in the different variables that go into real soil sample measurements. So I think there's a role there for both. We're not really seeing that being done just yet. Perhaps we're in the early stages of that when calculators that include soil carbon modules become mainstream, as well as reducing the sort of the margins of error in real soil sampling. Then I think it could be really powerful to look at both in tandem or different measures to be able to compare what a model is saying to what the results in farm saying, and see what the difference is there.
Final comment from Paul.
Thank you. Final comment, and it's a tricky question you're asking here. I think the fact that you have got carbon calculators to do these footprints is an indication of some of the trickiness of answering these kind of questions. Organic matter is variable within soils, in fields, no matter how well you try and limit that variability. Taking it from one point every time may overcome some of that variability, but generally you want to know what the whole field's doing for a number of reasons for your soil organic matter. And the trouble is there's variability within the sampling methods as well. So some of these, if you take or even a bulk sample from your field in year one, even though you may be adding organic matter year on year, it may take 5 to 10 years to show a significant difference between those soils, the fields. So it's not a perfected piece of science yet. It's not an easy method to. It's a relatively easy method to do. It's just the variability inherent is difficult to overcome. And I think this is causing a bit of concern for farmers, the ones I've spoken to recently, about how we measure this. If we're going to get payments from results, how do we prove that? Do we need to wait 10 years before we get paid? Or if we get paid in year one, in year 10, if we were still showing variability, and that might be nothing to do with a changing system in the farm where you're adding more organic matter. It may be something to do with the fact that the climate itself is changing, or methods on the farm, or other knock-on effects have reduced that. So are you going to have to pay that money back?
So basically, that's obviously a topic that's going to receive a lot of attention in the next few weeks and months and years. So we'll maybe get an answer to it more quickly. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to those who sent in questions, and thanks to our panel, George Bakey, Anna Sellers, Tim Garrity, Robert Ramsey, and Paul Hargreaves, and our production team behind the scenes. If you want to see more of this, it'll be on the FAST website for several weeks. There is, you're going to see a full evaluation form. This is the first time we've tried this particular type of event, and we'd be very keen on your feedback. Please do reply to that. We'd be very grateful indeed. So anyway, I hope you found this valuable. I hope you found it useful and thought-provoking. There's a big challenge ahead, and we need to share all the information we can. But for the moment, good night.